want to share with you a story. The story of when I first encountered a ghost. I was 16 years old, laying in bed at night, but I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. There was this overwhelming sense of dread surrounding me. And then, my bedroom door opened. Just an inch. None of my family was likely to be disturbing me so late, but if it was anyone, it would be my mom. So quietly, I called out to her. No answer. I felt fear creep through me. Surely, if it were someone who was supposed to be there, they would have said something by now, or at least entered my room. But the door remained only an inch open. It crossed my mind that it could be my dog. He had figured out how to open doors, so I called out to him, hoping he'd push the door the rest of the way open and trot in, laying my fears to rest. But still, no response. I was terrified now, thinking that it might be an intruder, but that couldn't be it. The house was dead silent. I would have heard him break in, or at the very least, I would have heard his footsteps coming down the hall. And come to think of it, I hadn't heard any footsteps at all. I laid there, staring at the door for a little while longer. When nothing else happened, I turned back around, telling myself there was some rational explanation for my door opening on its own, and I could figure it out in the morning. With my back now to the door, I closed my eyes and tried to go to sleep. But any chance of that happening vanished the moment I felt someone sit down on the edge of my bed. I was frozen with fear, telling myself that it had to be my mom, that it couldn't be anyone else but my mom. But I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard any footsteps. I didn't even hear any breathing. I tried to calm myself down. It had to be my mom. All I had to do was turn around and look. But even as I tried to rationalize everything that was happening, I knew it couldn't be her. But no matter who it was, or what it was, I couldn't just lay there and do nothing. I had to look. After what felt like eternity, I finally forced myself to turn around. I whipped my head back over my shoulder and saw nothing. And as soon as I turned, the weight on my bed vanished in an instant. I had no idea what to do, what to think, so I didn't. I got up, closed my bedroom door, and went back to sleep. There was no rational explanation for what I had experienced. Except there was. Ghosts aren't real. Hello everybody, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Sid Says. It's called that because I'm Sid, and I'm saying things to you. And I do not believe in any motherfucking ghosts. But Sid, I hear you cry. What about that super spooky ghost story you just told us? How can you not believe in ghosts after that? And my answer is that it's because I was lying a little bit. Not about my experience that really happened to me, and I was extremely terrified in the moment, but I did lie by omission and by saying that there was no rational explanation for what I had experienced. There is, in fact, a very rational explanation for everything that happened to me that night. First thing I failed to tell you was my headspace during that night. I did say I was feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, but the reason I was feeling that way was because I was kind of going through this existential crisis at the time where I had become increasingly aware of my own mortality and became so terrified of death that I didn't want to fall asleep out of fear of just not waking up. Just teen things. So anyway, that was my state of mind at the time. Okay, but what about the door opening on its own? Well, you see, that actually happened pretty regularly in that house. The construction was pretty shoddy and the doors didn't really close right, which means they often would randomly open about an inch anytime the air pressure changed even slightly. And the air pressure changed anytime someone opened or closed one of the other doors in the house, or when wind would blow in through open windows. And guess what? We always had the living room windows open at night to cool the house down. All right, but what about the most compelling piece of evidence? The fact that I felt someone sit down on my bed, and when I turned around, there was no one there. Well, this might be the biggest omitted factor of the story. I was already in a pretty spooked out state of mind by this point, so when I turned my back to the door, my brain thought, How scary would it be if I felt someone sit down on my bed right now? And then I did feel someone sit down on my bed. And the weirdest thing is, it felt exactly the same as when my mom would sit on my bed. So to me, this is evidence of this being sensation recall. If you have pets, it's like when you feel them jump on the bed when they haven't actually jumped on the bed. And it's even more convincing to me that this is what happened because when I turned around to look, the sensation immediately disappeared. Because my brain caught up and registered that there wasn't anyone sitting there, and therefore it corrected its error and made the feeling go away. And what's really funny is that in the moment I was entirely convinced that I had experienced something paranormal, but as soon as I woke up in the morning and was out of that heightened state of mind, I was like, wait a minute, that's bullshit. Ghosts aren't real. And I understand this is all just anecdotal evidence. Someone watching this right now might have had a paranormal experience of their own that they truly can't explain, and nothing I have said has convinced them otherwise. Which leads me to the thesis of this video. For the most part, I don't think people who have paranormal experiences are liars at all. I think they truly experience what they say they did. But whether what they experienced was a ghost is an entirely different question. I think there is a far more rational and scientific explanation for every ghost encounter that has ever happened: the power of the mind and the power of belief. Seeing ghosts has been happening to people for so long you could consider it a core aspect of being human. In fact, the oldest evidence of the belief of ghosts dates back to anywhere between 8,000 to 2000 BCE in Mesopotamia, including a 3,500-year-old tablet that has the first known visual depiction of a ghost being led to the afterlife, with accompanying instructions from an exorcist on how to get rid of any unwanted spirits that may be ailing you. And from there, the ghosts have just kept coming. One of the earliest recorded ghost stories comes from Pliny the Younger from 1st century Rome. He recounts in his letters the story of the philosopher Athenodorus, who rented a house in Athens and was supposedly haunted by the ghost of an old man bearing rattling chains. According to Pliny's account, Athenodorus followed the specter out into the courtyard, where it proceeded to point at a certain spot on the ground and then disappear. The next day, Athenodorus had the spot dug up, where he found a human skeleton wrapped in chains. After the body was given a proper burial, all sightings of the old man's ghost stopped. From there, we have our first accounts of a poltergeist, a ghost that causes physical disturbances such as loud noises or objects falling or being thrown around. This haunting was reported by a family in 856 CE Germany. According to the family, the poltergeist harassed them by throwing rocks, starting fires, and, quote, other things. During the Middle Ages and the subsequent rise of Christianity, the beliefs surrounding ghosts continued to evolve. They began to be seen as spirits with unfinished business who had to be preyed upon in order to move on, or they served as moral warnings, scaring the living by telling them that they needed to repent in order to go to heaven when they died and not end up an eternally suffering, wandering ghoul like they did. Moving ahead to times of modern warfare, ghosts started to manifest themselves in places associated with many lives lost during battle. There have been many spectral soldiers spotted on battlefields tied to the English Civil War, the American Civil War, and World War I in both Turkey and France. There's also the notorious HMS Queen Mary, a repurposed cruise ship that was used by the British Royal Navy during World War II. During the war, it saw more than 300 deaths of the sailors on board. It was decommissioned after the war and now permanently resides in Long Beach, California as a hotel. Many guests and staff have reported hearing unexplained noises and voices and seeing over 50 reported ghosts. Every culture on Earth has their own ghost stories and belief, but a common thread amongst these beliefs is that ghosts return to the land of the living for some greater purpose. When they are able to meet this purpose, they get to move on to whatever that culture believes is the next step in death, whether that be an afterlife or reincarnation. Another common thread seen in every culture is the proliferation of ghosts during times of turmoil. During the Civil War, for example, the practice of spiritualism began to rise. It was an outlet for those who had lost someone they loved to the war, or were just otherwise surrounded by death and strife, who desperately wanted to resolve their trauma and seek closure. With this new public interest in ghosts rising in the 1850s, scientists began to take interest in if there was any scientific evidence to back up the belief in the paranormal. One of the first surveys taken to classify and analyze types of hauntings was conducted by Robert Dale Owen in 1860. And 20 years later, an organization was founded to undertake the enormous task of either proving or disproving the existence of ghosts using the scientific method, the Society for Physical Research, or SPR, which leads us to our next section. In 1886, the SPR published a survey written by three of its members, Frederick Myers, Edmund Gurney, and Frank Podmore. It was titled Phantasms of the Living and detailed 702 anecdotal reports sent in by people outside of the society who claimed to have had a paranormal experience. The three members conducting the survey took great care to establish the authenticity of each statement provided, traveling the entire country to hold face-to-face interviews with the people who sent in their claims, as well as their friends and family. In short, they did their due diligence to make sure the participants in the survey weren't trolling and truly believed their paranormal experiences. By the end of the survey, the society members came up with a theory that the participants were most likely not actually seeing ghosts, but rather creating a mental image. In other words, they were hallucinating. But obviously, as scientists, they couldn't just stop there. Over the next 8 years, they conducted an even larger survey called the Census of Hallucinations. In this survey, they asked 17,000 members of the general public if they had ever experienced a visual, auditory, or tactile hallucination. Of the 17,000 surveyed, 1,684 responded that they had, and of those 1,684, 30 of them had experienced hallucinations that were death coincidence. And that's a fancy and old-timey way of saying that these 30 people experienced these hallucinations very soon after someone in their life had passed away. And that might sound like a small number, but doing the math, the SPR members calculated that the rate at which people were experiencing these death coincidence hallucinations were 440 times more likely to see a ghost compared to someone who hadn't experienced a death. And this statistic hasn't fluctuated much throughout the years. Between 1890 and 1990, several of the same surveys have been conducted, and the results generally stay between 10 to 14% of people experience hallucinations after experiencing death around them. Now, at first glance, this might sound like evidence against my argument. Surely the prevalence of people seeing ghosts after witnessing a death is more evidence that ghosts exist. Well, not exactly. An experiment by SPR member Raymond Moody was conducted in 1993 to test this phenomenon. He used an ancient Greek technique of communicating with the dead known as psychomantium. To conduct the experiment, he took his subject to a small room where he draped black fabric on the walls and only lit it with a dim light. Once in the room, the subject was instructed to sit in a chair in front of a mirror and look deeply into it. Multiple participants in the experiment reported seeing the apparitions of their loved ones and even holding conversations with them. But here's the kicker. With all these subjects, Raymond talked with all of them right beforehand at length about what each participant wanted to see and to recall significant memories. In other words, he had planted a seed in their minds that they would see what they manifested, almost like a subconscious forced hallucination. This would also explain why people who have been around death are more likely to see a ghost, not because they're actually seeing a spirit, but because they don't want to believe that someone they knew is gone, and so their mind plays tricks on them. Put that in combination with a low light setting, which is a known factor in visual hallucinations, and the predisposition these subjects had to believing in the paranormal, and you've got yourself a recipe for tricking yourself into thinking you've seen a ghost. Okay, but how can we say for sure that these are really hallucinations? For all we know, they actually could be ghosts, and would you believe it? The SPR tested for that too. In a later experiment, the same settings were recreated, but this time the researchers set up common ghost detecting tools in the room, including electromagnetic spectrum analysis and infrared cameras. And shocker, they didn't capture any evidence of ghosts. But speaking about ghost detecting equipment, Let's talk more about that. Benjamin Radford is an editor and writer for multiple different science and skeptic columns, books, and magazines. While his credentials are quite impressive and he is definitely a reliable source, I just want to point out his clear bias before I dive into his evidence because it is very clear in the article I'm going to be citing from. With that said, the reason I still decided to cite this article for my video is because while mean-spirited, this article does a really good job of pointing out logical errors. So let's dive into what Radford has to say about the science of ghost hunting. Radford starts his article by pointing out that ghost hunting is paradoxical. The less scientific the methods and equipment, the more likely a researcher is to find evidence of ghosts. Ghost hunters use a variety of creative and dubious methods to detect their quarry's presence, including psychics. Psychics not only claim to locate ghosts, but also to communicate with the spirits who, unfortunately, don't provide any useful or verifiable information from the afterlife. See a seance. God, he is so petty. I love it. But speaking of seances and psychics, don't worry, we'll circle back to them. Radford goes on to explain that while most ghost hunters claim to use the scientific method and capture evidence with a slew of scientific equipment like EMF readers, high frequency microphones, and infrared cameras and the like, the equipment is only as good as the person using it. Not to mention, most of the devices they're using weren't made with the intention of being used to capture evidence of ghosts. As Radford puts it, you may own the world's most sophisticated thermometer, but if you're using it as a barometer, your measurements are worthless. Radford spoke with Tom Cook, a man selling what he claims to be scientific paranormal investigation kits. Cook explained that in his kits, he included gadgets such as an EMF reader because EMFs can detect the fluctuation of energy fields, and that rapidly fluctuating energy fields are usually a sign of ghosts. However, Cook also admitted that changing energy fields are quite easy to find, so either that means there are a fuck ton of ghosts everywhere, or perhaps that EMF readers are completely bogus when it comes to detecting ghosts. And the cherry on top is that at the end of this interview, Cook admitted that there exists no device that can conclusively detect ghosts. And that's just the truth. There has never been a fully infallible, conclusive device that has ever been able to actually detect ghosts. And because of that, there is no evidence to support that ghosts have any link between fluctuating energy fields, temperature spikes or drops, photography, etc. As Radford says, these devices are based on nothing more than guesses, unproven theories, and wild conjecture. If a device could reliably determine the presence or absence of ghosts, then by definition, ghosts would be proven to exist. I own an EMF meter, but since it's useless for ghost investigations, it finds not spirits but red herrings. I use it in my lectures and seminars as an example of pseudoscience. The most important tools in this or any investigation are a questioning mind and a solid understanding of scientific principles. Radford goes on to say that believers will just about claim anything as evidence of ghosts. EMF readers going off, temperatures changing, dowsing rods crossing, getting a headache, or just getting a bad feeling have all been used as evidence. Because the standard of evidence is so low, it's little wonder that ghost hunters often find evidence but never proof of ghosts. Radford goes on to have a little fun by asking all the usual skeptic questions like, if ghosts are just dead people, why isn't the whole world just covered in ghosts? Why don't hauntings happen everywhere? Because considering the amount of people who've died throughout human history, yeah, every inch of this earth should be haunted. Not to mention, there shouldn't be any unsolved crimes because if ghosts were real, why don't they just reach out to the living to tell us who killed them or who robbed the grocery store down the street last week? He also asked a question I never thought to consider, like, why do ghosts wear clothes? Because if ghosts are just the disembodied spirits of the dead, they should be naked because clothes don't have souls. Unless you're saying clothes do have souls, in which case you can't be trusted. But either way, it's a far more logical conclusion that you aren't seeing a ghost, but rather the hallucination of how you remember or imagine a ghost to look. In which case, it does make sense for the ghost to be wearing clothes. Unless you always imagine ghosts naked. You fucking pervert. Whew. Sorry to set up a losing light fast. But Radford's final point is that with the amount of people dedicating their whole lives to the pursuit of finding ghosts, if ghosts truly existed, surely we would have found evidence of them by now. And looking at the evidence we do have, None of it is any more compelling than it was 100 years ago, but there has been an update in ghost hunting methods. So let's talk about the most recent one. The Estes method. The Estes method uses a ghost hunting device known as a spirit box. How it works is that the spirit box rapidly scans through hundreds of radio frequencies, creating a white noise effect. How it's reported to work is that ghosts are supposed to be able to manipulate these radio frequencies to create words or noises. In other words, the spirit box lets you speak with the dead. And there are many problems with the spirit box. For one, how do we know for certain that ghosts, if they exist, have the ability to manipulate radio waves? What evidence is there? Newsflash, there is none. Second, the function of the spirit box is innately designed to provide false readings. By its nature, it is scanning through radio channels, and would you believe it? Some radio channels have people talking on them. And when ghost hunters hear these little snippets of words, their bias gets in the way, and instead of coming to the logical conclusion that the word salad they just heard is from a string of different radio broadcasts, they claim it was a ghost talking to them. In reality, the messages of ghostly origin result from listener bias, suggestion, and audio illusions. Sentences from broadcasts are often incomplete, meaning that the phonemes, human speech sounds, can be misheard and, more importantly, misinterpreted as relevant to whatever ghost a ghost hunter is trying to communicate with. Prior knowledge of an alleged haunting can influence ghost hunters to interpret audio as direct answers to questions asked, when this is unlikely to be the case. Choppy audio with gaps in words and sentences can cause one word to merge into another, resulting in something which sounds familiar, or the ghost hunter fills in the gaps, often without even realizing they're doing so. However, the ghost hunting community has listened to the skeptics community's cry of bias, and they've actually listened. And that's where the Estes method comes in. The Estes method aims to remove any ability for bias to sneak into the equation by having one person listening to the spirit box using headphones while a different person asks questions. The person wearing the headphones cannot hear the question asker and therefore cannot interpret the sounds they're hearing in a biased way. They'll just shout out whatever word they think they hear. So this fixes the bias issue, right? Well, no. The person who's receiving the answers is still open to bias. For example, let's say they ask, "Who is with us?" And the person listening to the spirit box yells out, "Dog." The receiver could be like, "Oh my gosh, I remember that one of the groundskeepers who used to work here owned a dog. We must be speaking to him." Also, even if the listener can't hear the questions being asked, they're still open to bias as well. Maybe the listener also knew about the groundskeeper who owned a dog, and so when they heard a half warbled word that kind of sounded like dog, that's what they shouted out. And there's also the fact that, like I mentioned before, there is no evidence to suggest that ghosts can manipulate radio frequencies in the first place, so yeah. Overall, I think trying to introduce science as a way of proving the existence of ghosts is very commendable. And I honestly think the majority of people who do it are doing it with altruistic reasons and not because they're trying to sell a scam or something. Although there are definitely people who are doing that. But despite their best intentions, ghost hunters will fall into many unscientific biases and fallacies. The biggest one being confirmation bias. Hunters will go into a location with the idea in their heads that it's already haunted and look for evidence to prove it rather than to go in with the expectation that it either is or isn't haunted. Rarely have I ever seen a ghost hunter investigate a place and be like, there weren't any ghosts in there. Oftentimes, ghost hunters will disregard any evidence they find that disproves their theory of ghosts and instead latch on to any evidence that confirms their theory. And this just goes to show how unscientific they actually are. This practice of selectively presenting data that supports your hypothesis while ignoring data that contradicts it is an unethical practice known as cherry picking, which results in biased and often misleading research outcomes. It is also a habit that has plagued most ghost hunters for as long as they've been around. And please let me preface this last statistic I'm about to share with you by saying that I do not think that people who believe in the paranormal are stupid. But research has consistently shown that paranormal beliefs are often inversely related to scientific literacy. That is, the higher levels of paranormal belief a person reports, the lower their science literacy rates. Science literacy and critical thinking skills are mutually reinforcing, empowering people to question assumptions while analyzing evidence objectively. So, Again, not saying you're stupid, but maybe watch out for scams and don't get your medical advice from social media. All right, let's say you're still unconvinced. So, what if there isn't any scientific evidence to support that ghosts exist? People still see them all the time. And you're right, that's true. So, let's talk about that. But actually, before we talk about that, let's hear from this video's sponsor. Me. That's right, me. Because who else is gonna bitch at you about monsters not being real while simultaneously being a huge uke for fictional monsters? And I heard if you subscribe to my channel, instead of seeing ghosts, you'll just see me out of the corner of your eye every so often. What was that? Guys? I'm scared. So if you want to guarantee that you'll be haunted by me instead of some bitch-ass ghost, please give me a like, subscribe, and go check out my various social medias linked in the description below. Thank you! And back to the video. I touched on this topic a little bit in the previous section when I discussed how most ghostly encounters could be chalked up to hallucinations, but let's dive a little bit deeper into that theory, shall we? My first source comes primarily from the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit at Goldsmiths University in London. This unit is led by Dr. Chris French, and their primary goal is to research the psychology behind paranormal belief. According to Chris, he theorizes that there are three main reasons to explain why people see ghosts: prior belief, context, and hallucinations. Chris says, when people hear the word ghost, you visualize ghosts walking through walls, rattling chains. People do report stuff like that, but it's very rare. It's much more likely to be more vague sensations, a sense of presence, feeling dizzy, changes in temperature, shivers up the spine. Hallucinations are much more common than is generally realized. Anybody can hallucinate under conditions like extreme sleep deprivation, high stress, or high temperature. It's also important to note that context and prior belief is a huge factor in people experiencing paranormal phenomenon. If you're shown around an old building and somebody says it's haunted, you'll notice every little creak and change in temperature in a way you wouldn't have done otherwise. There are also a few more scientific explanations for ghostly feelings. Some locations are prone to electromagnetic field fluctuations, which can disturb brain signals, causing hallucinations. And some low-frequency sounds can cause your eyes to vibrate, also causing hallucinations. But all these explanations are still only theories, so Chris and his team decided to put them to the test by creating an artificial haunted room. They achieved this by suggesting to participants that they may experience some strange sensations when they entered the room, and then blasted the place with infrasound and electromagnetic activity. But the results were pretty surprising. Or maybe not. You see, the team found that regardless of if the infrasound or electromagnetic fields were on, people still reported weird feelings in the room. 8% of them even reported feeling terrified. So in the end, two of the scientific theories may have been ghost-busted, but it also proves that the power of suggestion is the greatest factor in paranormal experiences. But of course, those three factors are far from the only scientific reasonings for seeing ghosts. Chris also brings up sleep paralysis, a condition that causes people to be effectively awake while still dreaming, rendering them unable to move. Other common symptoms include experiencing things that sound suspiciously like paranormal activity, the feeling of being watched or like you're not alone, pressure on your chest, and of course, hallucinations. And the thing is, sleep paralysis can happen to anyone for any reason or for no reason at all, so it makes sense why someone might mistake this terrifying experience as something paranormal. There was another study conducted by Dr. Shane Rogers, a civil and environmental engineering professor at Clarkson University in New York, where he investigated the link between haunted houses and mold. He decided to conduct this study after noticing his children's strange behavior after being exposed to mold in his basement, and also after noticing how people on haunted house shows also exhibited similar behavior. And would you believe it? There's a lot of overlap between paranormal encounters and mold exposure. Aspergillus mold, which is often found in damp buildings, can cause shortness of breath and optic nerve inflammation, causing dark figures to appear in your line of sight. That's funny. I'm sure there's no correlation between that and the fact that shadow people are seen in a lot of derelict, damped, haunted buildings. And in addition, black mold has been known to cause feelings of fear. And to add more credence to this theory, Shane was able to find evidence of these molds in 13 locations that were considered to be haunted. Okay, but as fun as mold is, let's get back to what this section is really about. Returning to members of the SPR, when it comes to psychology, they have a few theories to explain ghost sightings. Number one is exaggeration. The longer ago a ghost sighting happened, the more likely you are to exaggerate the details. Suddenly, a flower pot getting knocked off a table becomes a flower pot getting thrown across the room. Number two is imperfect memory. Memory is fallible even when it comes to something you just witnessed. And the longer ago something happened, the more likely you are to recall it incorrectly. Next is collaborative testimony. Two or more people who believe they saw a ghost may discuss it with each other, swapping information between them and tainting their testimony. This may lead to people who once saw a vague white shape suddenly recalling far more details that were not present originally. Which leads to the next one, mistaken identity. It happens far more often than you'd think, but sometimes people will see other people and mistakenly think they're a ghost. This often happens when people are already in a heightened state of belief or fear. Like in our next explanation, hypnopomic and hypnagogic imagery. This is a fancy way of saying the shit you see when you're experiencing sleep paralysis. Next, of course, is suggestion. If you tell someone they might see a ghost, they're more likely to see a ghost. In a similar vein, we have expectation. If you've already believed to have seen a ghost, you're more likely to expect to see more. And then, of course, we have our last and most malicious explanation, which is hoaxing. This is when people will knowingly fake paranormal evidence for whatever reason, usually publicity or attention seeking. But of course, hoaxing can lead to outside observers genuinely believing a location is haunted. But I believe that a vast majority of ghost sightings are genuine in the fact that they are not intentionally hoaxes. And this is a common held belief by many psychologists who research this topic. But for the people who believe in ghosts, it isn't enough for scientists to say that there isn't any evidence to support the existence of ghosts. They want us to present evidence that ghosts don't exist. However, it is impossible to prove a negative. And so they use this and their own selective evidence as fuel for their beliefs. As retired philosophy professor Dr. Robert Todd Carroll puts it, if one is selective enough, one can confirm just about any hypothesis. This former science writer, Deborah Bloom's The Ghost Hunters, provides a selective history of physical research to support the view that maybe some of these stories are for real. After all, we can't prove they're not. So all of this has been so interesting so far, but why am I trying so hard to convince you that ghosts aren't real? Do I hate fun? Do I hate whimsy? No. But as the evidence suggests, the belief in ghosts is directly correlated to being more gullible, and this unfortunately has led to many people being taken advantage of. Let's return to mediums and psychics. A medium is someone who says he or she can get ghosts to come to the room to give signs to the living that the ghosts are real. These meetings never take place in broad daylight. Scientists who have looked into seances say that they are held in the dark because it is easier to trick people that way. The medium or his assistant can produce objects, move things, or make noises and speak in a mysterious voice, while the others can't see what anyone is doing. Many mediums have been caught cheating. But seances being held in a dark room with only candlelight are pretty much a thing of the past these days. Now we have mediums with talk shows who will cold read any member of the audience in a bright, open room. No room for gimmicks, right? But this is where confirmation bias comes back into play. The medium will say something intentionally vague and wait for the audience members who already believe them to be psychic to fill in the blanks for them. This process is known as subjective validation. But what's the harm in this? A few things. First, let's talk financial. While television mediums aren't necessarily financially abusing anyone, individual mediums often do. In fact, it happens so often that both the AARP and the United States Postal Service have issued warnings about psychic scams. Psychic scams deprive citizens of both money and emotional well-being. In these schemes, spiritual scammers with no psychic gifts set out to make a quick buck. They are good at telling people exactly what they want to hear. They promise to remove a bad luck curse, bring people great fortunes in their future, or even help them find their soulmate. People who buy into these scams are being taken on an emotional roller coaster ride that continues to require more and more money to reach their desired outcome. Of course, they never do. Psychics and spiritual mediums scam millions of people every year and can seriously affect the lives of Americans and their families. According to the AARP, 4 out of 10 US adults believe in psychics and mediums based off a Pew Research poll. And in the US alone, there are nearly 94,000 practicing psychics who offer their services in exchange for monetary profit, aka scammers. But the website does point out that it's relatively harmless to do a one-time reading or seance for $20, and I agree. However, most psychics won't be content with that. And scammy psychics will often emotionally manipulate their clients to keep them coming back, promising to remove a curse, restore your health, bring you riches, or return the love of your life to you if you pony up enough cash. Scam psychics prey on people who are grieving, lonely, or struggling emotionally, physically, or financially. And here's a disgusting statistic for you. The AARP Fraud Watch helpline noticed a spike in psychic scams during the COVID-19 pandemic. Heinous! And the deception doesn't begin and end with psychics claiming they can see the future or commune with the dead. There have been many cases of these people claiming they offer free services only to demand payment later, as well as demanding for payment up front and then ghosting their clients, never fulfilling their end of the bargain. And the very predatory psychics will demand upwards of thousands of dollars for their services, preying on people who are desperate and believing enough to pay it. And of course, they never fix all your problems during the first session. After giving a reading, a scammer may say you need help clearing away negativity. Once that's done, the fortune teller comes up with another costly service or ritual that must be performed if you are to achieve happiness. The swindler may use high-pressure tactics or resort to threats about future bad consequences if you don't keep paying for services. And even if financial turmoil isn't a factor, psychics and mediums can still be very harmful by causing emotional turmoil. I used to think that TV mediums were relatively harmless fun until I heard about the story of Amanda Berry. On April 21st, 2003, teenager Amanda Berry went missing a day before her 17th birthday. For nearly 9 years, she was held captive by her kidnapper. But while she was still missing, her mother, Luana Miller, became increasingly desperate to find her. And about a year after Amanda's disappearance, Luana went on the Montel Williams show to speak with the medium Sylvia Brown. Luana wanted comfort. She wanted any kind of confirmation, any scrap of hope to hold onto that her daughter was still alive out there. And Sylvia told her, "She's not alive, honey." Amanda was, of course, still alive, but Luana never learned this, because about 3 years after Amanda went missing, Luana died. Friends of the family said that Luana died of a broken heart after being told by Brown that Amanda was dead. The official cause of death was heart failure. Luana was only 44 years old, but the people close to her directly linked her deterioration in health to her appearance on the Montel Williams show. After being falsely told her daughter was dead, she had given up hope. And despite public outcry after Amanda escaped her captor and was proven to be alive, Sylvia Brown never addressed what she did. She never apologized. Sylvia is dead now, and I don't really hate to say it, but good riddance. You can do more research for yourself, or maybe I'll do a deep dive on her, but she was truly a despicable person, the definition of disgusting predatory practices. No regard for people's feelings or the impact she had on their lives. No joke, she is the reason why I despise people claiming to be mediums so much. But despite how mad the idea of mediums make me, I do want to say that I don't think all of them are as bad as Sylvia. I think there are people who genuinely believe they have psychic abilities, and I know for a fact that there are mediums who offer their services for free. I don't think these people are scammers. I think they are genuine. Not real, but genuine. And my only problem with them really is their lack of critical thinking skills. Which leads me to my next issue with the belief in ghosts, which is that this belief can put people's lives in danger. In December of 1803, the people of the small village of Hammersmith in London began to report sightings of a ghost. The ghost was a classic white shroud ghost, but he was far from spectral, harassing the townsfolk and even sometimes physically attacking them. But despite this, most of the town believed the Hammersmith ghost to be a real ghost, and the fear of him was so intense that it may have killed people. Take this first report with a grain of salt since it's very old and also because the victim was never named, but according to one report, the ghost scared a pregnant woman so badly that she fainted and later died of fright. But other than this report, we do have one confirmed death related to the Hammersmith ghost. Thomas Millwood was a bricklayer in Hammersmith who left his house very late in the night to go to work, and his trade required him to wear a completely white outfit. And because of this, He had actually been mistaken for the Hammersmith ghost on two separate occasions, but nothing really came of it until the night of January 3rd, 1804. As he was walking to work, he was mistaken for the ghost one last time by a customs officer, Francis Smith. Believing that Thomas was the ghost, Francis pulled out his gun and shot him dead. In later questioning, Francis stated that he acted before he even knew what he was doing. His belief and fear of the ghost was so strong that it had caused him to kill an innocent man. But Thomas's death did reveal the real Hammersmith ghost. A local shoemaker, John Graham, came forward to reveal that he was the ghost. He had started the hoax to scare his apprentices as revenge for them scaring his children with ghost stories. And thus, the Hammersmith ghost is a known hoax. But that hoax still caused a real belief that led to real death. This is, of course, quite an extreme example, but I wanted to share it to show just how dangerous these beliefs can become. And as a last, less extreme but more malicious example, I want to talk about the Warrens. Ed and Lorraine Warren, made most famous from the Conjuring series, are far from their altruistic film counterparts. They abused people's beliefs and fears for their own gain, fabricated evidence to make stories more sensational, and caused more suffering than you can imagine. The Warrens were Catholic paranormal investigators in the 70s, and like most Catholics in the 70s, they hated what was happening in the country, that being women's rights, queer liberation, and civil rights. So they turned to fear-mongering to try to scare people back into more traditional values. All those famous cases that were associated with the Warrens all confirmed hoaxes. Amityville Horror, a hoax. Ed would get someone to wear a sheet and pretend to be a ghost in pictures and videos. Annabelle, a hoax. The story is literally a ripoff of a Twilight Zone episode. They would even hire novelists to create books about their so-called investigations and tell them to make stuff up for them. Ed once told his hired novelist Ray Garton to just make it up and make it scary. By the way, Garton was not an investigative writer. He was a horror novelist. And once the Warrens completed their investigations, they always reached the same conclusions. The demons and ghosts haunting their clients were brought on by their own sinful lifestyles. As long as everyone conformed to traditional values, conformed to patriarchy, conformed to the church, they would be safe. The Warrens are the ones who spread the lie that the real people, the real family that was murdered in the Amityville house, were murdered because they were practicing Satan worship. This was not only not true, but blaming the victims for their own murders. And they did this with so many cases. If their clients were experiencing depression, anxiety, delusions, or some other mental health crisis, they would blame it on demons and say that it was their own fault for not praying hard enough. Essentially, they would either exasperate existing psychosis in their clients or induce psychosis in their clients, all for their own gain, to further their own narrative. They even went as far as to blame people who suffered from addiction or sexual assault for those things happening to them, claiming that they succumbed to evil. In short, they were telling people that bad things only happen to bad people. So if something bad was happening to you, then you deserved it. And the only way to cure yourself was to go to church and conform. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, they committed crimes against children. Massive trigger warning for this next part. I'm going to be discussing allegations of child sexual abuse. If that's too much for you, you can skip ahead in the chapters. In 2017, a woman came forward to say that when she was just a 15-year-old girl, Ed Warren, who was in his 30s at the time, had sex with her on a regular basis. Lorraine was aware that this was happening and did nothing to stop it. She was even an active participant in the abuse. When the girl became pregnant due to Ed's sexual assault, it was Lorraine who convinced her to get an abortion, telling her that her pregnancy would ruin the Warrens' business. Ed was also known to get quite violent. He would threaten people regularly, and one time, the girl even witnessed him beating Lorraine until she was unconscious. But Lorraine is not a victim in all this. Even after Ed died and Lorraine sold their story rights to make the Conjuring series, she explicitly put in her contract that neither she nor Ed could ever be portrayed as sexually assaulting anyone, having sex with minors, or otherwise having extramarital affairs. And this was long before the allegations came to light. She knew they would, and she made sure that people would still view her and her husband as heroes instead of the monsters they were. Everything I just listed are quite extreme examples of what the belief in ghosts can do to people, and I admit that. And I admit that believing in ghosts casually will most likely not result in the worst outcome. However, it does significantly increase your chances of being taken advantage of. It does lower your capacity for critical thinking, and it can cause unnecessary fear and stress. But while believing in ghosts is scary, not believing in them is also scary. The fear of death is primal. why wouldn't it be? It's hard to imagine that someday you'll just be gone. Everything you knew, all your memories, all your feelings and thoughts just gone in an instant. And for some, it's even more painful to think that the same thing has happened to a loved one. And so we turn to the paranormal for comfort. It doesn't matter that there isn't any scientific evidence to back it up, because we need to believe. We need to believe that death isn't the end. We need to believe that the soul is real and that it persists after death. And I want to believe this too. I want there to be concrete evidence. I want there to be infallible scientific proof of the afterlife. That would be the most wonderful thing that could possibly happen. But as it stands, there is no concrete proof to back up any paranormal belief. And I've tried, but I can't trick myself into believing it without that. So, despite my love of horror and all things spooky, I'm pretty much the farthest thing you can get from being any kind of spiritual. But I don't think being logical has to go hand in hand with nihilism. And I don't think we need to believe in ghosts to believe that life has meaning, or to believe that, in a way, we live on after death. Just being human is a spiritual experience of its own. We are minuscule and extremely finite compared to the vastness and longevity of the universe. And yet, we are infinite. Our memories endure, even when we're no longer around to witness it for ourselves or when no one we knew is around to remember us. Our existence always was and always will be. We are made of stardust and little bits of the universe that have existed since existence itself, and when we are done with our lives, we will continue to live on as part of this universe. Energy can never be created nor destroyed, and so the energy that was once you will always be somewhere in this world, returning to stardust, returning to the cycle. We will forever have been a part of this beautiful work of nature, this unknowable, unfathomable, beautiful existence. Yikes! Things got a little heavy there at the end. Let's get back to silly times. Oh my goodness, what is that?
It's possessing me.
Thank you so much for watching, and remember, if you subscribe, you'll get to see me standing at the foot of your bed in the middle of the night instead of some lame-ass paralysis demon. But if you'd rather not get haunted at all, let alone by some random-ass YouTuber, don't even worry about it. Bye!